It is the evening of November 6, 1956. Inside the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Anthony Eden receives a telephone call from Washington. The voice on the other end belongs to an official from the United States Treasury. The message is brief, direct, and devastating. Britain has 72 hours to withdraw its forces from Egypt, or the American government will begin selling its holdings of British government bonds. The sale would trigger a collapse of the pound sterling. Eden, exhausted and unwell, understands immediately what this means. The empire that once dictated terms to half the world is now being given an ultimatum by its former colony. Within 48 hours, British troops begin their retreat from the Suez Canal. The crisis is over, but something far larger has ended. The British pound, once the world's dominant currency, the instrument through which London had exercised financial power for more than a century, will never recover its position. This is not a story about a single crisis. It is a story about how a currency dies, how an empire liquidates itself, and how the architecture of global power shifts in ways that cannot be reversed. To understand what happened in 1956, we must go back 11 years earlier, to the moment when victory became a form of bankruptcy. The Second World War ended in May 1945 with Britain on the winning side. British forces stood triumphant across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Union Jack flew over territories that stretched across a quarter of the world's surface. But victory had come at a price that few outside the Treasury fully understood. Britain had liquidated nearly all of its foreign investments to pay for the war. Assets in the United States, Latin America, and Asia had been sold off to purchase weapons, food, and fuel. The country's gold reserves, which once anchored the pound's credibility, had been drained. By the summer of 1945, Britain was functionally insolvent. It owed more than it owned, and it could not pay for the imports it needed to survive without external support. Britain had entered the war as a creditor nation, a country that earned income from investments abroad. It emerged as a debtor nation, dependent on loans from the United States. But the dependence went deeper than debt. The British economy had been organized around empire. British goods had flowed to captive colonial markets. Raw materials had flowed back to British factories at controlled prices. This system, built over centuries, had allowed Britain to run persistent trade deficits with the rest of the world while maintaining the value of its currency. The pound had been accepted everywhere because it was backed by the productive capacity of an empire. Now that capacity was exhausted. Factories had been bombed. Shipping had been sunk. Britain needed to import food, machinery, and raw materials, but it had little to sell in return. Without dollars to pay for American goods, the country faced the prospect of mass starvation and industrial collapse. In December 1945, the British government sent a delegation to Washington to negotiate a loan. The Americans agreed to provide $3.75 billion, an enormous sum. But the terms were harsh. Britain would have to make the pound convertible to dollars within 1 year, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate. This was a deliberate attempt by the United States to dismantle the system of exchange controls and trade preferences that had protected the British economy. The American government, influenced by free market economists and exporters eager to access British markets, saw the loan as an opportunity to force Britain into an open trading system. British negotiators understood the risk, but they had no leverage. Without the loan, the country would default on its debts and face immediate economic collapse. The loan was accepted, and in July 1947, as required, the pound was made convertible. The result was catastrophic. The run on the pound was so severe that Britain's dollar reserves nearly evaporated. The government was forced to suspend convertibility after just 5 weeks, but the damage was done. The currency that had once been considered as good as gold was now understood to be a depreciating liability. Britain retreated behind exchange controls, rationing, and trade restrictions. The economy stagnated. What replaced it was austerity, managed decline, and a growing awareness that Britain's position in the world had fundamentally changed. Yet, through all of this, one pillar of British power remained intact. The pound was still the currency of the sterling area that held their reserves in pounds and conducted trade in sterling. India, Australia, South Africa, and dozens of smaller nations kept their wealth in London. giving Britain access to resources without having to pay for them in dollars. This system allowed Britain to sustain imports and military expenditures far beyond what its economy could support. It was, in essence, a mechanism for extracting value from poorer countries to subsidize British consumption, but the system depended on confidence. If countries in the sterling area lost faith in the pound, they would convert their reserves into dollars or gold, and the entire structure would collapse. By the early 1950s, that confidence was eroding. Britain was still spending vast sums to maintain military forces around the world. These expenditures drained dollars and weakened the pound. Yet successive British governments refused to make the cuts necessary to bring spending into line with the country's diminished economic capacity. The reason was psychological as much as strategic. Britain's political class had been raised in an empire. To acknowledge that this role could no longer be sustained was to accept a kind of national humiliation, so the spending continued, the deficits widened. Then came Suez. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the waterway through which much of Europe's oil supply flowed. For Anthony Eden, this was an intolerable challenge. The canal had been built by European capital, controlled by European powers, and symbolized the West's dominance over the Middle East. Eden saw Nasser as a dictator who needed to be toppled, and he believed that Britain, acting with France and Israel, could accomplish this quickly. In late October, Israeli forces invaded the Sinai Peninsula. British and French forces followed, bombing Egyptian airfields and landing troops near the canal. The operation was militarily successful, but politically disastrous. The United States, which had not been consulted, was furious. President Eisenhower saw the invasion as a reckless colonial adventure that would drive Arab nations into the arms of the Soviet Union. More importantly, the operation had been launched just as Soviet tanks were crushing a rebellion in Hungary. The United States wanted to condemn Soviet aggression, but it could not do so credibly while its own allies were invading Egypt. Eisenhower demanded an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal. Eden refused. That is when the financial pressure began. The United States held enormous quantities of British government bonds, purchased during and after the war. If these bonds were sold, their price would collapse, and Britain would be unable to borrow in international markets. At the same time, the pound was under speculative attack. Traders, sensing British weakness, were selling pounds and buying dollars, draining Britain's reserves. The International Monetary Fund, effectively controlled by the United States, refused to provide support unless Britain agreed to a ceasefire. The Bank of England warned the government that reserves would be exhausted within days. Britain could not defend the pound without American support. And American support would not come until British forces withdrew from Egypt. Eden faced a choice. He could continue the operation and watch the pound collapse, triggering a financial crisis that would destroy what remained of Britain's economic credibility. Or he could accept the American ultimatum, withdraw, and acknowledge publicly that Britain could no longer act independently in defense of its interests. On November 6, he chose withdrawal. The decision ended his political career. He resigned 3 months later, his health broken and his reputation in ruins. But the damage extended far beyond one man's fate. The Suez Crisis revealed that Britain was no longer a great power in any meaningful sense. It could not sustain military operations without American approval. It could not defend its currency without American support. The empire, which had seemed permanent, was now understood to be a financial burden rather than a source of strength. Within a decade, nearly all of Britain's colonies would be independent. The sterling area, deprived of its political foundation, would disintegrate. Countries that had held pounds out of habit or coercion would diversify into dollars. The pound's role as a reserve currency would shrink steadily until, by the 1970s, it was essentially a national currency with limited international use. But the deeper damage was structural. The Suez Crisis did not create Britain's economic problems. It exposed them. For more than a decade, Britain had been living beyond its means, spending as if it were still an empire while its economy stagnated. The country had maintained expensive military commitments, generous welfare programs, and a standard of living that its productivity could not support. All of this had been financed by borrowing, by drawing down reserves, and by extracting resources from the sterling area. Suez made it impossible to continue the illusion. The markets understood that Britain was insolvent, and that the pound was overvalued. In 1967, the Labour government was forced to devalue the pound by 14%, a humiliating admission that the currency was worth far less than the official exchange rate suggested. Even this was not enough. In 1976, Britain faced another currency crisis and was forced to seek a loan from the International Monetary Fund, the first time a major Western economy had required such support since the war. The story of the pound's decline is often told as a story of bad decisions made by weak leaders. But this misses the deeper truth. The pound fell because the economic and political foundations that had supported it were destroyed. Britain's industrial base, once the most advanced in the world, had been surpassed by the United States, Germany, and Japan. Its empire, which had provided captive markets and cheap resources, was gone. Its financial system, which had intermediated global trade for a century, was being replaced by American institutions. These changes were not the result of policy errors. They were the result of historical forces that no government could have reversed. The war had accelerated Britain's decline, but the decline would have come regardless. An economy that depended on imperial extraction could not survive in a world of independent nations. A currency that derived its value from political dominance could not maintain its position once that dominance was lost. What replaced the pound was the dollar, backed not by empire but by productive capacity, military power, and institutional control. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the world's largest creditor, the source of capital and technology that other nations needed to rebuild. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, made the dollar the anchor of the international monetary system. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. This arrangement gave the United States enormous economic leverage, the ability to run deficits without facing the kind of currency crises that plagued Britain. When the Bretton Woods system collapsed in the early 1970s, the dollar's dominance only increased. It became the currency in which oil was priced, in which international debts were denominated, and in which central banks held their reserves. The British pound, once the instrument of global commerce, became a regional currency, used primarily within Britain itself. The City of London remained an important financial center, but it operated increasingly in dollars rather than pounds. British governments, regardless of their political orientation, accepted that the country's economic policy would be constrained by the need to maintain confidence in the currency. The days when Britain could shape the international economic order were over. The country had become a participant in a system designed and controlled by others. There is a lesson in this decline, one that extends beyond Britain's particular circumstances. Economic power is not a permanent possession. It is a function of productive capacity, institutional strength, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Britain failed to adapt. It clung to an imperial model long after that model had become unsustainable. It prioritized status over solvency, the appearance of power over the reality of decline. And when the moment of reckoning came, at Suez and in the crises that followed, there was no path back. The choices made in desperation during the war, the loans accepted on harsh terms, the failure to invest in industry, the refusal to cut military spending. All of these accumulated into a structural trap from which no amount of political will could escape. The pound's fall was not a tragedy. It was a reckoning. And in the silence that followed, a new order emerged. One in which financial power flowed through New York rather than London, and in which the currency that mattered was not the one with the longest history, but the one backed by the largest economy. History does not remember currencies. It remembers the systems they represented, and the moment when those systems could no longer sustain the weight of their own contradictions.